Hola, buenos días. Bueno, ya casi empezamos. Vamos a esperar que se sumen más personas. Good morning, everyone. We'll have the talk today this morning. We're gonna wait a couple of minutes so more people can join. Va a haber interpretación simultánea. Pueden accederla en la parte de abajo en el menú que dice interpretación en el Zoom. And there will be simultaneous interpretations from English to Spanish. And if you're a Spanish speaker, please use the bar below says interpretation. Okay, so let's get going. Good morning, everyone. And as I mentioned, there is simultaneous interpretation. Buenos días. Hay interpretación simultánea abajo. Ahí tal vez podríamos también avisarlo por el chat. Si me ayudan en eso sería genial, que la interpretación está disponible en la barra de Zoom para el español. Y so we'll be having the talk this morning with Jan from the university, from UPeace in English. So there will be simultaneous interpretation available from English to Spanish. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. We'll give, well, we already gave a couple of minutes so everyone can join and figure out the interpretation. We'll be having the talk in English. As you might notice in social media, La Ruta del Clima is making a series of talks on loss and damage and climate justice. And we have been focusing on trying to empower civil society and activists in the Latin American region on this issue, to broaden knowledge and to help us and help them to influence discussion on loss and damage, which lately in the past years have become an issue that was ignored for about 3 decades, but now it's something that is being developed a lot in the climate regime. And well, these talks look to address the issue from a human rights perspective. We're looking into different issues like finance, gender, and other key approaches to obtaining climate justice on the issue of loss and damage. And well, as you know, La Ruta del Clima is a leading international Latin American NGO that has focused on climate change advocacy and promoting citizen participation, especially looking to position the issue of justice, of loss and damage, and human rights in the international agenda from a global South perspective. And it seeks to work with other organizations, being an agent of climate knowledge and seeking to draw attention to the need to address the adverse effects of climate change in our communities all across the global South, and especially in the Latin American Caribbean region. Today we will have a talk on loss and damage in the context of capitalism. And for this, we're very honored to have my friend Jan Bretlin. And Jan Bretlin is an associate professor from the Department of Environment and Development and Peace at UPeace, which is a UN-mandated university. He's originally trained as forest engineer in the Technical Institute of Costa Rica, has a master's degree on environmental sciences from Wageningen University and Research. Sorry, my German never improved. And well, actually, he's Dutch from the Netherlands, and a PhD in peace conflict studies from the University of Peace. His interest includes political ecology of forest cover, climate change, and conservation. So before we give the space to Jan, thank you everyone for taking the time to join. Please do use the question tool that we have in the Zoom, the Q&A. And I leave you to Jan for the next 40 minutes. Thank you, Jan. And I think you can go ahead, Jan. You're muted. Or maybe let's just give a little bit of time because I think Jan's internet froze. And yep, well, I mean, at least we have time for more people to join. So maybe recap a little bit on the instructions. We have, tenemos interpretación al español. Jan, are you back? I think so.
Yes.
So yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, that was a nice, thank you for this intro, but also that my internet just went away for a second. Sorry about that. So can you all see the presentation?
Yeah, go ahead, Jan.
Okay,
it's
perfect.
okay.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Like Ariane said, my name is Jan and I work at the Department of Environment and Development here in Costa Rica at the University for Peace. And so this topic, which is a relatively new topic for me, loss and damage. I've been dealing with climate change for a while already, of course. And it's a topic that is one of those that is, for me at least, a bit hard to transmit optimism. So I apologize already for maybe not gonna lift your mood too much this morning. But yeah, I think it's important to look at everything that we look at through the lens of our economic system. I think that is important. We need to look at history, we need to look at how we organize our global and national economies in order to understand what is going on and what the potential is for these, let's say, processes and tools that we come up with to hopefully achieve some sort of justice. So the structure for this short talk is basically this, that I want to look at this question of why some people, some regions, countries seem to be suffering more from loss and damage, or at least the potential from suffering from loss and damage. And looking at different explanations that are out there that you can read about in the literature, on websites, on reports, and also during conversations with people simply. Because everybody has an explanation these days. Then I want to look obviously at capitalism itself. I didn't prepare like a super deep analysis of capitalism because that is not really the topic, but I do want to look at some characteristics of capitalism and trying to explain why it is so hard, right, to expect anything that resembles justice from a system that is inherently unjust. So, and also looking at the point of why capitalism is by nature bad for the environment and also contributes and causes social inequality. And finally, maybe the analysis, or let's say the deeper part of this whole thing, is looking at this question of, is there hope? Should we have hope for loss and damage under capitalism? And we can discuss that also together in the half hour that we have after the talk. So when I look at this idea or this reality that there's an inequality in vulnerability towards loss and damage, right? So not all people, not all regions are, let's say, under the same threat. And it's interesting to analyze why this is so, right? So there are some arguments out there that I, for the sake of simplicity, make it very clear what I think about them. I don't know if you've heard those. And there are some, for example, who say that there are simply too many people, and therefore there is poverty, and therefore poor people will suffer from loss and damage, because they simply don't seem to understand that they shouldn't have so many children, right? So racist arguments like that are very common. Malthusian thinking is out there. It's still present in many UN reports. in many people's minds. That is the underlying issue of why we have climate change also. Another one that is even more directly racist is saying that people in the global north have a different approach to life, right? It's this idea of the Protestant work ethic. So this argument basically claims that poor people are poor because they are lazy, and therefore they are more prone to be vulnerable to climate change, right? Because they are poor, because they are lazy. So those arguments, I will not talk more about them because I think they are quite simplistic and racist, and therefore shouldn't be taken seriously. They should be criticized. Other ones are, if you read some of the, let's say, bestsellers on these topics, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and books of that sort, they kind of come with this apolitical and, if you want, also slightly racist arguments that say that climate, weather, and geography define how people approach life and how they organize. And I know that is debatable. You can, there are probably a lot of things that might be rescued from those theories. But it's still, I think, a dangerous road to go down. And then there are some, let's say, more, I call them political arguments, because they do take into account choices of societies or choices of leaders. If you think about, there's this famous book called Why Nations Fail. The main argument there is that inclusive institutions are present in countries that have made it, that are not so much suffering from loss and damage, and probably won't in the future either. So the global northern countries, or some of them at least, because I don't think the United States has very inclusive institutions, for example. But maybe national policies, so choices in politics and policies that have made societies stronger, more resilient, basically. And then there's an argument, or in today's world, at least a very extreme, I think, point, which is the eco-socialist, eco-Marxist argument that what we see today, this inequality in resilience and in vulnerability to loss and damage, and vulnerability to climate change in itself, is basically caused by a long process, a historical process of imperialism. It's the result of colonialism and of, like it says there, this economic model that is based on plundering, on extracting resources in some regions for the benefit of other regions. So these power dynamics that we see today have been happening always. And if you know what I'm talking about, if you want to read more about it, this is basically dependency theory or world system theory. And capitalism, or neoliberal capitalism, is simply the present form of that same approach of development, or the same approach of how we organized as a globe, or have been organized by some. The economic system is based on this whole approach of extracting and enriching some regions more than others. And that, under that perspective, explains why there are these differences in vulnerability. So basically then, what we see today is not a natural outcome, right? It's not an apolitical outcome or consequence of climate change, but it's caused by actions, by real actions, and by a structural and systemic process that is still happening. Right? So, like I said before, colonialism, imperialism, extractive capitalism, and this approach to growth at all costs, and racism are all fundamental in explaining this inequality in vulnerability. And they also explain, of course, the existence of climate change. So let's say in the critical geography, in academia, this has this idea that the way we have organized our economy is kind of described in this paper here in this theory already for 23 years ago. O'Brien and Leichenko, they came up with this framework calling it the double exposure, where basically they are saying that certain communities in every country, but also certain regions over the world, have been exposed to climate change and to economic globalization. So this inequality and vulnerability, again, is caused by certain things and just made visible by climate change, right? So the suffering and the destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of life, is not necessarily only caused by climate change, but caused by the conditions that made certain regions and societies weak. So when we talk about these things, I think it's important to keep in mind that, contrary to what some people insist on, this inequality, though, or the struggle to reduce or to completely eliminate this inequality is not going to be easy, right? It's not something that can simply be done by discussion and convincing with rational arguments. So that is one thing that most of my students, for example, have sometimes a hard time with, that to accept that is going to be a bumpy ride, right? It's going to be violent. It's going to be tough. You know, this fight for justice is always tough. And the other thing that I find important to mention also is, with all this talk, it's important to not fall into the trap of victimizing the global South, right? And just make them the victims of others, of powerful players. There's also some blame on local elites, right? So this is a system that shouldn't be seen only at national level, or country or nation state level, but it's something that happens in every society, right? There's people in the global north that also are more vulnerable to climate change than others. And there's people in the global south who are just as guilty of causing climate change and of causing this vulnerability to climate change. And it's tough, right, to talk about an unjust and unfair situation and not simply take agency away from these people and from these regions, right? It is something that we have to remember always, that there is it's important that we can still communicate the trust in those people, but they will need help also. I don't know if I'm making my point clear. We can maybe discuss later on. So on capitalism, and again, sorry if it's too basic what I'm saying here, but I don't know exactly what you guys studied before or how much you have looked into this. But so in very, very simple, it's a very simplistic description, let's say, of capitalism, but it's a system that's based on competition, basically, and it depends on expansion and growth, right? There cannot be capitalism if there is no economic growth. So by its nature, it has to expand. You cannot stay still. You need to grow as a company, as an economy, unless you want to be basically eaten by your competitors. And that process leads to a concentration of resources and power, right? So that's why we have these monopolies suddenly. You know, you have companies that take 90% of the market of a certain product, and then they can dictate the prices, basically. So again, inequality is a natural outcome of the capitalist system. Eco-Marxists and eco-socialists have talked about that a lot and have identified some of them. I think there's a guy who wrote a book about 17 contradictions of capitalism. There are two main ones, I guess, that are looking at how the system basically is a suicidal system. Right? It undermines, destroys the economic and environmental conditions for its existence. So again, we can talk about that if you want in the discussion. Basically then, environmental degradation and the climate crisis are symptoms of capitalism passing the planetary limits. It's not an accident. It's not a crisis per se. It's a part of capitalism is that reaching limits and crossing these limits. So like I said at the beginning, capitalism in that sense is simply a continuation of older systems that were based on expansion, on a state of war development model, right? Where you have to grow and you have to expand. And you are competing between different empires, between different nations. And finally, this idea that you can have a type of green capitalism or a green economy, which is a very nice idea if you want to calm your anxiety, right? Is that actually possible, right? So the only explanation of how people can insist on greening the economy, and the only reason why we have this insistence on sustainable development and a system that is based on an idea that we can keep on growing economically forever, even if we are in a finite system. So all this is only possible if you have faith in technology. So this term techno-optimism is basically that you put your faith in our capacity to become more and more efficient, and therefore we can keep on producing more and more with less and less impact. There's a term for that, which is called absolute decoupling. We have reached relative decoupling, so we can now produce certain items, certain processes allow us to produce with less and less environmental impact. But absolute decoupling, which is the only thing that actually matters in the long term, is still a fantasy, right? So even if we become more efficient per unit of production, let's say in greenhouse gases, the total amount of greenhouse gases is not going down, it's actually going up, as most of you know, I guess. Here are some just graphics again of showing this inequality in producing emissions per capita and total. Different countries have very different per capita emissions and very different total emissions. So the question of should these people, these countries pay for loss and damage? Absolutely, right? That's not even a question, I think. They obviously have to. The question is, will they, right? And that is when it becomes a bit difficult for me to keep up the hope, you know? Looking at the history of how powerful countries have behaved in the past. So this is a graph that circled the planet, I guess, a few days ago. At least that's when I saw it. Jason Hickel, I think, had it on Twitter. And this basically shows how you can compare the different regions of the world that will suffer most from climate vulnerability versus the countries that have emitted more CO2 emissions since 1751. And you see that there's what we already said, global northern, richer countries have emitted much more CO2. And the majority of countries that will suffer from these emissions are in the tropical regions, in the ex-colonial regions. So the countries who have contributed the least are the ones that are mostly affected, and vice versa. So that brings us to this final discussion, I guess. Is there hope for loss and damage under capitalism? And like I said, for me, it's it's hard to imagine, right? It's I have to really struggle with becoming optimistic in this. Not that they should, like I said, they have to, they should pay for it, but I question if they actually will, and that is easy to understand. No, I understand why they wouldn't, because they can simply not pay, and it's politically a struggle for, let's say, the United States or any rich country. How do you convince your society that you should start paying billions of dollars for the damage that you have caused in the past or in the present also? Apparently, it's easier to do that by just sending billions and billions to finance a war in a different part of the world. That is apparently not questioned, but if it's about loss and damage and helping others, then there's apparently a strong reaction oftentimes in societies, which is interesting. So there's ideological and geopolitical issues to be considered as well, right? Again, if we look at international relations theory, we are living in a realist world where every country is competing with the other countries. And that's a very harsh and cynical worldview, but it reflects more and more again what we are observing right now. Sorry. So on all levels, I think we also have cultural challenges as individuals, as societies, right? We are used to this idea that I don't have to help anyone, but unless it's Christmas time or unless I have a lot of extra cash in my car, and then I can feel good about myself and give some of that to others in need. But normally we don't live in societies where that happens a lot. There's also this belief that, especially among the rich, that you deserve what you have, right? So this meritocracy is something that is very hard to question because it's very comfortable to feel that you have what you deserve. Right? That is a topic that is very close to me. I have that conversation with individual people a lot, but I see that also at broader scales, right? This idea that a country feels it deserves to be, the chosen people and all that. We have had these things in history. There's also a general ignorance of how inequality is created, right? Like I said before, there are different explanations out there that are hard to extinguish. And this attitude of, the winner deserves to be better off and to take it all. Another thing that maybe is stretching it a bit, but another reason why I'm not so hopeful for loss and damage under capitalism is this, what has been observed over the last decade or so, how climate change has been securitized, right? So there's an emphasis on using the climate change crisis or the climate crisis as a reason to increase military spending and to basically the basic response by many of the powerful nations to climate change is by increased military spending. So that is something that is scary because that money could have been used for adaptation and for loss and damage and for many other things, even mitigation. So in that sense, then climate change is not really being addressed at all. These countries seem to have accepted that climate change is coming, is already there, and the only response that they have is to increase the size and the technology of its military. There are obviously also a lot of things happening in the world always, but especially in this last decade also, different conflicts that have gone on, and broader geopolitical issues that are always linked to these conflicts that don't seem to be going away, right? There's also, basically all the things that are happening that make people and nations focus more on their own well-being than on the well-being of others. And also, if we think about how in the past up to now, the amount of resources and time and money and whatnot that has been spent on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, or loss and damage type repayments, if at all, they don't seem to be enough, right? They haven't been enough, and they are not enough now. So this instead of a world that is more and more united, we're seeing the fragmentation of economic blocs. European Union is seeing a rise in right-wing politicians and politics, populism in Latin America and Europe. I don't know how it is in other places, but I think that is something that is probably happening everywhere. We think about the Philippines, for example, and I'm sure there are other examples. So this populism from left and right, a focus on nationalism, and again, this dominance of the realist perspective. And I'm almost done. So as this guy MacDonald 5 years ago wrote this paper that is, I think, one of the most accessible in these topics relating security and climate change, is so this global problem, instead of being addressed in a common way with cooperation, it's only addressed by individual states focusing on their own well-being. And that means that there won't be, or isn't, a lot of space and resources available for other regions. And even worse, the people who suffer most and will suffer most from loss and damage and from these conditions that basically make them leave their home countries and home regions, these people are, instead of being seen as victims or as people who need our assistance and our help, they are seen as threats to national security of the global north. We're seeing that now with, the over 2,000 people coming into Costa Rica every day on the Panama border. Yesterday, they just showed some horrible images of that. These people are fleeing not only from climate change, but obviously from other conditions as well. And so these people are basically part of the threat of climate change and of other actions. They are perceived as a threat to national security in different countries, especially in the global north, but also in Costa Rica. Right? They are there, and what do we do with them? They are desperate, they start to cause all kinds of social problems. And that is very problematic, right? I'm not trying to justify that at all. I'm just saying it's something that is observable, and it's a very scary scenario, right? To be seen as somebody who is a threat to national security. And the other point that he makes that is important, I think, is that the idea that securitizing climate change means that we are securitizing the status. We are trying to secure the status quo from an external threat, and that is problematic. Again, from what I said at the beginning, because the status quo that is being protected under this worldview is the one that has caused both climate change and the vulnerabilities of these regions and people. So by securing or trying to defend the status quo, we're not actually dealing with the issue that we have to deal with. We're prolonging the problem. Finally, past development aid and, like I said, adaptation and mitigation efforts were not enough and not in the correct form. And what we're seeing in reality is that this these the few countries that have, let's say, accepted the idea that we will pay into this fund, there's simply not enough there. Another point important, I think, is that this growing visibility of climate impacts in the global north, which I thought at the beginning was a good thing, that then people would start to act and become more understanding of the suffering of other countries. It might actually be the contrary, right? So if Germany suffers from climate change impacts, maybe they will be even less willing to help others because now they have to help themselves. So, and this is my kind of conclusion and my entrance to the next part of this session, which is that we can discuss hopelessness or hope, right? So I feel mostly hopeless. What gives you hope, if you have any? And if you don't, how do you deal with that feeling of hopelessness? And how can you keep on working and being interested in this topic under that hopeless feeling? That would be the talk. So I hope we have some questions, comments.
So thank you, Jan, for your talk. I think at least from my perspective, as someone from an organization that has been working on loss and damage, this idea of finding hope and it's very important. And I do have some questions, but I do want to invite people to please use the chat or the Q&A tool to make some questions and to share their perspectives. That would be great. But in general, I think to me you said two things that I might like you to expand a little bit. This idea, I think you said double. Let me
Double
see
exposure.
Double exposure. Yeah, that's something that we have been working a lot as or want to work far more in what we do, because at least in the Central American perspective, when you see all this extractivism, and when you consider what is loss and damage, that I mean, if you put it into a linear formula, you would have the threat, you have like vulnerability, exposition, and then you have risk. And from the IPCC, loss and damage is just residual risk, whatever you couldn't adapt to climate change and all those damages. But in our case, our vulnerability is not defined by an apolitical, ahistorical context. We have lots of transnationals working and exploiting our region, being mining, agro, or even just generating inequality per se, and profiting from the vast inequality, not only in Central America, but in the whole Latin American Caribbean region, that generates vulnerability. And many of those at the same time have a huge carbon footprint or are based in countries that have historical huge carbon footprints that have been leading and remain increasing carbon emissions around the globe, and then bring back the effects that we then feel them as loss and damage. So how do you imagine this idea? Because this is something we're trying to imagine, like how to either ethically or politically in a narrative be able to convey what is going on in Latin America, where you have these two forces of capitalism, of neoliberalism, led in many cases by the Bretton Woods institutions that are now by so many hailed as the solution to funding and resources to tackle, because apparently the developed countries, after colonialism and exploitation for so many decades, have no money. And but we're stuck in this like cycle, in this dialectic of exploitation and increased vulnerability. How would you explain that?
So I think you already explained it, right? So it's the cycle is easy to understand if you are open to that kind of analysis, which is a historical analysis and an analysis of the present. So this double exposure is exactly that, right? It's saying the vulnerability to external threats, let's say climate change, is created, right? It's a precondition. It's not created by climate change, by the threat. And that is actually seen also in the global north. When you think about environmental justice, how it started and all that, it was on racial lines, right? So that the Black community was mostly suffering much more from environmental impacts of industry and of whatever than the white population. So environmental justice came from an analysis of racist environmental focuses or whatever. My point here, I think that's what you're asking, like, how do you talk about that? And how do you convince people that this is important to see, right? For me, what I have seen, and that is my own personal view, is you have to be very careful in today's climate to not use the word Marxism anywhere, to not use anything that sounds lefty, especially in Latin America right now, because you will just have so much opposition, right? From ideological perspectives or from people who simply are too lazy, or I don't know what I can find an easier or a less aggressive word, but it's hard. People who don't want to engage in that discussion and don't have the means or the times to do so. So ideology is always a problem. So if you talk about it in terms of fairness, without falling into this ideological discourse, I think that's the best that you can do. So it is a political issue, but you have to talk about it in an apolitical issue, as an apolitical issue. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah.
But you know, that's what I see. For example, if you publish articles in certain journals, certain terms will not be used. Why are these guys using economic globalization? They're talking about capitalism, right? But they don't use the word capitalism. And that is fascinating. In so many journals, you will not see the word capitalism. You will see industrial development, economic system. Even I use that several times in many of my presentations. I don't use the word capitalism because it creates this reaction immediately. Oh, you're an anti-capitalist. That means you want to live like in Cuba. That means you want to live in Caracas today, right? And no, that's not what I want. But I think,
in itself, it's a bit of a problem itself. Like we try to accommodate to power, and then when we find ourselves like we do now, 3 decades into a failed UNFCCC convention that has not accomplished its objectives, and it just keeps going as that does not matter, and has failed to address the question of economics. And I mean, I'm a Marxist, I confess. I can't hide it pretty much, but I mean, sure, let's not talk about Marxism, but let's talk about new economic models, and that is something that is not done. Like it is scientifically proven that the current economic system is leading us to destruction. Either, and I think it at least in my imagination, after so many years of reading about this, it won't be like a one thing, like in 6 months extinction sort of thing, but it will be drop by drop, decade by decade, where we'll be drying up or drowning into this really complex, dire situation where, of course, developed countries are very preparing to, by militarizing. I mean, just the buoys that Texas has with racers floating in the river just to kill people if they try to swim over to the US. I mean, that should tell you something of what is coming. But what I do find lacking, at least mainstream economics and dishonest, is the fact that, I mean, if we want new ways to deal with it, where's the discussion? I mean, where is at the UNFCCC, instead of just Bretton Woods and all this like fancy restructuring that doesn't really deal with it, where is the new economic that we need to face nature and science? And I think we have some questions and a hand raised. So I'm gonna first read Eric's question. And what is the position of Kenya in the global space for climate adaptation? I see nothing is happening even with our disaster management fund and the national and country level at times as we as society to support a situation orchestrated by climate change, one being Kenya for Kenyan, that is raised to fund to support Turkana drought victims. The government didn't respond. And let's look at loss and damage and marginalization. And I think marginalization is a key word. What do you think, Jan?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the situation in Kenya, but I'm guessing that it's similar to many countries in the global south, that you have this mix of the lack of international assistance, but also the lack of national movements and in helping poor people. That is happening in every country, right? I don't know if it's again too cynical, but yes, most often what we see with climate change and other things, we come to realize that some people don't seem to matter, right? At the international and national and local levels. People are very quickly apparently become seen as irrelevant, which is a horrible reality. And
yeah, I think we have a hand raise. I don't know if Jen in the controls can give Adelina the chance to speak. I'm sure I'm unable to do that. I think you can now. Go ahead, Adelina.
Hola, buenos días. Un placer en realidad este tipo de espacios porque justamente, ¿verdad? Nos interesa todo el tema de cambio climático, sus efectos e impactos y especialmente en términos de pérdidas y daños. Mi pregunta más bien es un tanto pasar de la parte política a la parte meramente operativa. Bajo todo este marco, ¿verdad? De la agenda global, de la agenda internacional de cambio climático, que sabemos, ¿verdad? Cuáles son los espacios donde se negocia, ¿verdad? La situación de los países más vulnerables, precisamente. Estoy hablando de Honduras, Centroamérica, y nuestra principal preocupación a nivel de terreno, cómo, si existen, tienen experiencias en realidad de cómo se trabaja operativamente la agenda de justicia climática a nivel global y cómo vincularla desde el punto de vista del trabajo que necesitamos cada vez más a nivel local, a nivel de la comunidad, a nivel de los países, a nivel de los gobiernos en realidad que estamos conscientes que no representa justamente una agenda nacional a nivel de nuestros países. ¿Cómo hacer en realidad, cómo fortalecer, si tienen alguna experiencia en realidad donde podamos procesar, digamos, toda esta información desde lo que representa la agenda global y lo que representa nuestros esfuerzos a nivel local? ¿Cómo vincular esa agenda? Gracias.
Gracias, Adelina. No sé, Adrián, ¿vos querés hablar primero? O sea,
no, adelante. And everybody that is in English, please do switch to the interpretation channel for it. Adelante, Jan.
No sé ni qué decir. Yo siento que, digamos, el tema en Centroamérica y en muchas regiones de Latinoamérica que digamos que sufren de una mezcla de realidades bastante difíciles, para decirlo así. En mi visión, probablemente van a depender de ONGs, de tal vez Naciones Unidas, pero creo que ONGs van a ser los primeros que van a ir entrando en ese vacío institucional que hay. Es complicado, ¿no? Obviamente, usted lo sabe muy bien. O sea, es complicado en miles de formas. Tengo, por ejemplo, un conocido mío que trabaja en una ONG que tiene que ver más en el tema de seguridad alimentaria. Es una ONG de Estados Unidos que ha trabajado ya como por 2 décadas, creo que en ciertas partes de África, y ahora van a abrir una oficina en Honduras. Eso es lo que estoy observando, ¿no? Que lentamente están, ojalá, tomando en serio la situación humana, porque no es un tema necesariamente solo ambiental, ¿verdad? Es un tema de, como usted dijo, de justicia ambiental. Entonces, cuando hay problemas así y el Estado está, por cualquiera que sea la razón, no está interesado o no es capaz de reaccionar o no quiere reaccionar, eso también pasa. Entonces, ¿qué queda? Quedan las ONGs, quedan las organizaciones que viven de estas tragedias de cierta forma. Yo no quería decir esto como una crítica o un cinismo hacia las ONGs, pero es verdad, ¿no? Hay financiamiento para los temas más extremos, digamos. No hay... El problema de Costa Rica, por ejemplo, comparando con Honduras, es que nadie va a invertir, ni ninguna ONG va a venir, aparte la de Adrián, que ya está aquí, a pelear por justicia ambiental en Costa Rica, porque no hay muchos fondos para Costa Rica, porque Costa Rica ya está bien, supuestamente. Sabemos que no, pero eh, hay, hay mucho énfasis en países africanos por lo extremo que está la situación allá, y ahora en el famoso Triángulo Norte también, ¿verdad? Honduras, Guatemala y ¿qué es? Salvador, creo. El, el, el norte de Centroamérica, básicamente. No sé, eso sería lo que yo tengo que decir. No tengo, no tengo mucho más conocimiento en ese tema,
Muchas
digamos.
gracias, Jan.
Ujú.
Muchas gracias, Adelina, y más bien muchas gracias, Jan. Creo que ya podemos ir cerrando porque se nos cumple la hora. Creo que ha sido un excelente acercamiento a este tema de esperanza. Creo que para nosotros imaginarnos futuros justos, es una misión que tenemos, uno de las ideas, digamos, que estamos viendo en el tema de esperanza. Creo que la mayor esperanza que podemos tener es la justicia. Creo que hay muchas herramientas que podemos imaginarnos cómo transformar nuestra sociedad real, nuestra economía, nuestra política en lo que queremos todos y todas. Y por ahí está la esperanza, en construir eso que es práctico, eso que existe, que hemos visto que existió en el pasado, que existe en otros países y reunirlo en nuestras realidades y luchar por ello. No es fácil, a veces puede ser radical, a veces nos pueden tintar de muchos colores y banderas, pero sí, simplemente lo que buscamos es un futuro digno y una comunidad donde la vida sea viable, donde podamos disfrutar el día a día, que esa es para mí al menos el sentido de la vida, poder ser felices todos y todas. Y entonces en eso, Jan, a todos ustedes y todas ustedes que nos acompañaron, un gran abrazo y pues tengan una excelente mañana. Muchísimas gracias, Jan.
Gracias a ustedes y gracias por tu mensaje también. Cuando yo digo que no tengo esperanza, no es que estoy feliz con eso, ¿verdad? Y la esperanza no hay que perderla realmente, pero a veces cuesta. Pero
Ah,
obviamente hay que
perdón.
seguir, ¿verdad?
Solo hagamos una pregunta más porque si no, ya me
Dale, dale.
regañaron que no la vi. Dice Gina Cortés, ¿cómo usted ve el decrecimiento, teniendo un rol o siendo en el cambio, siendo disruptivo en estas discusiones en el tema del Acuerdo de París o acuerdos internacionales? Y también para darle chance a Eric, el sur global está más afectado por el calentamiento global y necesitamos justicia. Pues entonces respóndele de una vez, cerramos.
La pregunta era, ¿qué pienso yo del decrecimiento de
Sí,
ese
que si va a ser
movimiento?
un cambio o va a ser destructivo en el Acuerdo de París o en los acuerdos internacionales.
Estamos hablando de degrowth, ¿verdad?
Ajá.
Ok, yo creo que es súper importante que empecemos a imaginarnos cómo podría funcionar una economía que no crece. Creo que tarde o temprano vamos a llegar a ese punto y la pregunta es, ¿nos preparamos antes y la manejamos o esperamos que el cambio climático o otra crisis ambiental nos obligue a vivir en una economía sin crecimiento, porque el crecimiento infinito es imposible desde mi perspectiva. Entonces, de crecimiento viene en algún momento. Ojalá lo podamos manejar nosotros y planificarlo, pero para eso hay que empezar. El problema en este momento es, como dijimos antes, que el sistema capitalista está tan metido en todos nosotros que no nos podemos ni siquiera imaginar, ni siquiera nos damos el tiempo, aparentemente, para imaginarnos otro tipo de modelo económico. Pero creo que sí está agarrando muchísima fuerza. Nuestro compañero Robert Fletcher, justo anteayer hablé con él y me dijo que ese tema está cada vez más visible en Europa también, o especialmente. Y sí, eso creo que es un tema para el futuro. Definitivamente vale la pena meterse más en eso.
Listo. Bueno, ahora sí, tengan un buen día. Hasta luego. Gracias.